And I'll never forget walking into the room. It was a rainy day in New York. We were downtown, and I walked into a room and absolutely sopping wet, and there was Julianne Moore, and she said, "You even look like my son." And I was like, I've never been so grateful for my freckles in my life. I was like, thank you.
So let's get right to the meat of it. What's it like being a heartbreaker?
Oh, God. I don't know. I'm certainly not a heartbreaker.
There's a serious side to that question. So you seem willing, as we witnessed in the clip reel there, and anyone who's been following your work, you seem willing to really take on characters that demand the audience engage in a physical reaction themselves, whether it's emotional, I guess in a classic Hollywood way, you'd say in a tearjerker, or in a horror scenario, or a kind of, some sort of real tragedy. That's a risk as an actor to take with an audience, that you're asking them actually to be with you rather than to want to be you. And I'm just wondering if that's something that's conscious for you as you're creating these characters, knowing that you are actually, you potentially are inciting a reaction that might be very physical for your audiences.
Oh, that's a great question.
There's the heartbreak. We're going back to the heartbreak.
There are various things there. I suppose the first thing for me is the idea of choice, the idea that you have choice. I want to make it absolutely clear from the get-go that I get to do something I'm absolutely passionate about, something I love since I was a kid. But there's no question that this idea that one strategizes or makes really specific career decisions, I mean, one dreams of that, but very few people in this industry have that choice. And so whilst there have been moments when I've been lucky to be able to say yes or no to something, there's also been a lot of auditioning for things, whatever it is, trying to retain employment. But that being said, I think what you're referring to is an emotional or a visceral reaction to something. And I am someone that I'm a pretty indecisive person by nature. And I've learned over the years to try and train myself to live by instincts. And when I first read a script, I'm a really bad reader, very slow reader. It takes me forever. And I'll do anything to distract myself. But if I'm kept engaged by something, and if I feel an emotional reaction, like I did when I read Les Mis, and also I'd seen the stage show, but certainly with The Theory of Everything, and my week with Marilyn, there were absolutely visceral moments. Or with Savage Grace, one of the films that you saw there, which I'm not a huge amount of people have seen, but it was a film with Julianne Moore, and that was again a very visceral reaction I had to it. So I try and trust those instincts.
Well, we're very glad you do, because they work. We get engaged, and certainly with The Theory of Everything, I'm not alone in having left the theater in tears, but also inspired in a way. But I think what made me really think about it is folks of your generation and younger and even older at this point, it feels like there's this push to be the kind of superhero movie star, right? So that you're this character that's very aspirational, that audiences would go in and, I want to be that guy or that gal. And you seem determined to act and be a movie star. And to really, again, engage with an audience that doesn't aspire to necessarily be you, but to actually be with you or your character. And that also perhaps allows for a vulnerability in you, that, audiences think that maybe you're more approachable or something, rather than being up here on this pedestal. And I know you said it's not all about distinct choices that you're able to make, but it does seem that you've been able to navigate that, say.
Well, I also think it's interesting, the term movie star. It's one that, in Los Angeles, people often go, they'll literally ask that question, do you want to be a movie star? And I always respond, I don't know what that means.
Well, you're already one,
well,
so there you go.
I don't know if I am, at all. But I think there's something. Don't get me wrong, I also love those films, and I've been up for a fair share of them and had really interesting experiences. I did a film, it's not a superhero movie, but a big sci-fi sort of space opera called Jupiter Ascending that comes out next year with the Wachowskis, and every job has its own challenges. And that, that was really an extraordinary challenge in its own right, because I have a limited imagination, and when you work with the Wachowskis, they have such an extraordinary imagination that when you go to work with them, it's like you're jumping into their world, and you have to trust them entirely. And my fear with that film, a lot of which was shot on green screen, was this idea that, what if you can't imagine it right? What if you can't take yourself there? And I thought that might be quite restricting, but in the end, it ended up being one of the most liberating things, because actually you give yourself over entirely to the directors. Whereas on something like Hawking, the Theory of Everything, educating yourself about every single detailed element around it is, it was such a different process. But one of the things that I keep finding with this life, which is an odd nomadic one, is that there is great variety to be had, and you've got to you've got to love the variety, which I do, and keep challenging yourself in different ways.
So you've touched on a number of things that I want to come back to through this conversation, and we're going to be drinking our vodka-flavored water throughout the conversation, so if we get a loose at a certain point. But let's go back to the beginning, to the background. I had the privilege of at least seeing your mother, if not formally meeting her earlier this week, and I have to say she's a stunning woman. You were the spitting image of your mother. It's really a shame you're not a girl, because you would have been a beautiful woman, but I guess we can't have everything. And you and I are both kind of cursed with this baby face disease, but you've been working since you're 20. You're now 32, if Wikipedia can be believed. So you've been at this for a while. Let's talk about when you started out and that initial inspiration to go into, I suppose, theater at first and then film soon thereafter.
Well, I come from a family who are not in this world at all, and I just had that probably slightly irritating, precocious enjoyment of theatre when I was a kid, and they would take me to Les Miserables and to the sort of big musicals. They'd take me and my brothers, and weirdly that there's a sort of symmetry to that, in the sense that it was going to see Les Mis when I was about 7 or 8, and seeing the little kid playing Gavroche, clearly taking the day off school, was getting to run around, be an urchin, be a hero. I was like, looks like he has a good life. I want what he's got. And so I started, I did stuff at school, and I had, I then, when I was 12 or 11 or 10 years old, no, 11 years old, they did a production of Oliver in London, which Sam Mendes directed, and it was before I think he had got into film, and I auditioned, and I was like urchin number 46 / book boy. I had a named part. I had a specific line that went, "Books you order from the bookseller, sir." And it was, I remember it still. It's a goodie, a very important plot line, I'll have you know. And I got to leave school during the day. I got to go to the London Palladium, and I got to kind of hang out in the, but I was one of hundreds of kids. The casts changed, weekly, and. But I got the bug, I think, and it was amazing because it was firstly Sam Mendes. I don't think I even met Sam Mendes whilst doing it, because I was several casts in, and they're big machines, these. But I remember it stayed on my CV for a long time until I actually had to go and meet Sam Mendes for a job, at which point I was like, I should probably take his name off, given he'll have no idea who I am.
Have you met him since?
I have, yes.
And does he acknowledge that he remembers you in the cast?
He certainly has no clue. But the other lovely symmetry was then Jonathan Pryce, who's a wonderful actor and has always been a great mentor to me, played Fagin in that production. And years later, my first play in London was a play called The Goat, an Edward Albee play, and I got cast in that, and Jonathan was playing my dad, and I arrived on day one of set, and I was like, John, we've worked together before. And he went, really? I was like, yeah, I was in Oliver. He goes, oh, really? What were you, Oliver, Dodger? Because he had hundreds of those. I was like, I was urchin number 43 / book boy. He was like, forgive me for not remembering you. Yeah.
And remind us what your capacity was, amongst other things, in The Goat with Jonathan. You told a little anecdote of.
So, well, I played. It's an amazing play. It's a play that's set in New York. It's about this sort of couple, very successful couple. They have a gay son. Everything is going fantastically well for them. And it transpires that the husband is he's clearly having an affair. And then the affair is with someone called Sylvia, who it transpires is a goat. And the play, it's extraordinary because it goes from, it was a new piece of writing, so it was the first new play I'd done. And it goes from this like utter comedy, like this extraordinary thing to a depth of tragedy. And it literally has Greek elements to it. And I remember this extraordinary thing of being able to be off stage every night and hear an audience roaring with laughter, knowing that with somehow through what Albie had written and what Jonathan and his partner Kate were doing, I knew that the audience would be in tears by the end, and that was really the power of that world that excited me. But I got it was my first time ever in the West End, and my opening line, I wasn't in the first act, and my opening line was I came on in the second act, I was playing their son, and the lights went up and my opening line was, "You're doing what? You're fucking a goat?" Like this. And then Jonathan playing my dad was like, "Don't swear in front of your mother," or something. I'm like, "Wait, you're fucking a fucking goat? You're telling me not to swear?" It was like this. And to get to say that on the West End stage, that was a great moment for me. Less good was the moment less good was the moment when I had to kiss my dad later in the play, when there's all sorts of confusion going on, and my family would come and watch it, and my brothers would basically come and watch my dad sort of squirming as I went through it.
Well, I bet Jonathan Pryce remembers you now.
Yeah, he's a good friend, thank God.
Yeah.
It took several shots, but yeah.
So sticking with theater, we here in New York, of course, remember your great triumph in Red, not so many years ago. And what struck me about that, getting back to this idea of choosing to be an actor or actually being an actor, your character, Ken, is dealing with somebody who's a star, right? He's a star artist, Rothko, at the height of his powers, but he's also faced with this choice between commercializing his practice and perhaps remaining true to something. And you're this voice of reason. And we do this. I read about you. I put things together. And I say, oh yeah, Eddie's the voice of reason and consciousness and art. Was that something that really, for you, has resonated beyond just doing the play? Because it somehow feels like maybe it has.
God, it's extraordinary having someone who's seen lots of your things, finding patterns in it. It's amazing.
Kind of like being on a therapy chair. You ignore these people.
I hope you guys are enjoying this therapy session for me, because no, that's what an amazing point. That play was at a period where I'd done some theatre in London. I then got into film. People often say this idea, theatre is real acting and film is this somehow a sort of a lesser thing as far as the craft is concerned. And the thing that I found was when I started doing film, and it took me 4 years after starting being an actor to get anywhere close to getting a part in a film. And that first film that I did, I went to Australia and I was playing opposite Toni Collette, a wonderful actress. And after I'd only done theatre, and after like an hour of my first time in front of a camera, after an hour, she's like, "Ed, do you want to go and watch the playback?" And I was like, no, the director said I'm not allowed. She's like, "Come and watch the playback." I'm like, no, I'm not allowed. She's like, "Come and watch the playback." Thank Christ, because my eyebrows are doing this. I was sort of basically doing performance, like projecting to the back of the stalls, when actually the camera was here. And the amazing thing that I learnt through that was this idea of really distilling everything to something that was closer to a human truth. And that's what a camera sees. And what I've always loved is varying those two things and coming back to theatre and then going back to film. And maybe similarly, that confusion or oscillation between like commerce and art, that by the point that I got offered Red, I had done, still trying to learn. I didn't go to drama school, so I was still trying to kind of learn by osmosis from other actors. And I'd worked with some amazing actors, but I'd done some scripts that I thought were going to be great with great actors that really didn't work at all. And some that I thought were awful scripts, but I sort of needed to work, that ended up being kind of interesting. And I realized there was something alchemic that happens in film that I had no idea about. But when that play came, I was a bit disillusioned. And when I read it, I studied history of art at university, and it was one of those amazing moments when everything you're interested in, the commerce, art, the idea of being theatre, it literally being about an artist, but also this idea that Rothko would turn up to work every day in a suit in the Bowery, and he'd turn up at 9 and he'd leave at 5. The idea of like artists, practical artists, everyone trying to find form in the formless is really interesting to me, and I find this life of being an actor in some ways is so wonderful, that you get to live your dream, but it's so unstructured. You're so out of control. You really do have very little control. That always trying to find some sort of order, and that was Rothko's way. But that whole experience started as a little play in London, working with Alfred Molina, who is just the dream, like one of the great human beings and great actors, and we went on a big journey with that, and with Michael Grandage, who actually. Felicity Jones, who's in The Theory of Everything. Michael was a great supporter of mine and Felicity's very early on, and that's sort of how we knew each other. So it was a very, it was an amazing moment.
I'll come back to your generation's ability to kind of merge art and commerce, which I think is important, because that was also, I think, a bit with Ken representing the Warhols and the Rauschenbergs and the pop artists who kind of came after, who really were able to synthesize art and commerce brilliantly. But speaking of Felicity and some of the amazing, I mean, just going through your filmography and the work you've done, you've worked with some amazing ensemble casts and some brilliant directors. But you actually seem very gifted at two-handers as well, or not as well, but maybe, kind of rarely so. That, I'm thinking Theory of Everything, which folks will see soon if they haven't already, My Week with Marilyn, Savage Grace, and Red in theater. This ability to kind of carry either a picture or a play on an intimate scale, a very intimate scale between two people. I don't know, talk a little bit about that, if you have a preference, if you prefer the grand scale of Les Mis, or if they both bring different things to you and are fulfilling.
Well, the only thing that I've just sort of realized, having worked for a few years now, is just what scenario makes you work best, and for me, it's being given the environment to be brave enough to screw up, basically. And because I think often the most interesting work happens when someone goes, okay, I've got an absurd idea. It's probably absurd. Can I try it? And those directors that go, for sure, do it, and it normally fails. But those directors are going to try again, rather than going, we've got 5 minutes. You really got to get on with it. It's costing money. All of this sort of stuff is that's when I. Tend to do most interesting work. Now, part of that is trusting the people around you. And so maybe what you're referring to as far as the more intimate element of working in two-handers is that, of course, when you're working with someone that intensely, you develop that relationship and you do trust each other, and you have the ability to be braver and again, to sort of make mistakes. But I am forever, and having started in theatre and really being really illiterate as far as film is concerned, when I look at amazing screen performances and think that actor may have met the person playing his mother 30 seconds before the camera started rolling, everyone, including myself, I used to go, yeah, but they can have as many takes as they want. They really can't. Like, they really, really can't. Like, whatever that first instinct is often the thing that's caught. And so I'm in great admiration for people that can really make you believe when there is no, generally in film now particularly, there is no rehearsal time. But one of the great gifts of The Theory of Everything, the Hawking film, is that James gave us time. He gave me 4 months to prepare.
Well, that would seem especially critical in this sense, because it was not only the verbal, but also the physical very much in that, which maybe the theatrical performance is lent to. I mean, Red was also, in a way, a very physical performance as well. So what happens when it doesn't work? You've been in a few projects. Yeah. I know we're here to talk about how great he is. Don't worry, we're not going to linger on this stuff. But you've been in a few that haven't worked.
Oh my God!
What happens?
Hundreds.
Like so. No, not hundreds. Just a few. And I won't name them because I don't do that. But can you tell as it's happening, like as you're making it, and if so, do you panic? Like, or is it never has it not been the case so far that you can tell as it's happening, oh God, this is a turd, like, gotta move on?
That's a great question, and it's one that it's like a constant, like that's the unknown. That's why people say don't invest in the film industry, is because there is no guarantee. And I've done films with literally extraordinary casts and really formidable scripts that I'm like, oh, we're safe here. This is going to be, and I'll be a bit part, but like I know I'm going to be part of something wonderful in it, and it really won't work. And on the other hand, I've done the opposite. It's very easy for me to choose theatre, and it helps that I suppose I've been lucky with the theatre, so I have a bit more choice there. And there I just go, okay, this is like a proper equation, right? Imagine that rehearsal's a nightmare, the other actors and we all get on horrifically, and then we get horrifically reviewed, no one comes and sees it. Is there enough in a text? Is there enough in a character that 3 months on, when you're performing to a quarter of the house, is there enough there to keep you going? And that's literally the sort of the rule book that I try and use. With film, you can't do that. I mean, it's that there is I describe it as alchemy. There's something else that happens, and the sort of control freak part of you you can't control everything.
And you've never been discouraged, obviously not to the point where you've stopped working, because you've been thriving. But that's the hardest part for me to imagine. Not being an artist myself, or being a miserably failed artist, I can admit, is worrying that you put yourself out there and you do have to trust your collaborators, and then when it doesn't work, that somehow you're able to process that and move on.
Well, the thing that I've learned, I think, subsequently, is that everything's there for a reason. And for example, there's a film called The Yellow Handkerchief, which was with William Hurt and Kristen Stewart. It was the scene in the film there, and I was playing an adopted Native American from northern Oklahoma. And I remember, actually, Gene Parsagan, my manager, who's here this evening, I remember I was in town, and he's like, it's a wonderful script. And I read it, and I was like, it is beautiful. He's like, you should go for an audition. I was like, I'm never going to get cast as an adopted Native American from northern Oklahoma. And he went, go to the audition, Eddie. And I went to the audition, and because I was so convinced I didn't have a hope, I just sort of I describe it as like throwing mud at a wall. I was like, there you go, and walked out. And then I got offered the part, and I was like, I sort of had to go and speak to the director to sort of tell him that what I'd done in that audition was complete, like, I couldn't do an actual part from that. That was just like a sort of moment of absurdity. Anyway, we went through the making of that film. It's a little film. It didn't have a huge audience. When I was speaking to James Marsh, again, for The Theory of Everything, the director of The Theory of Everything, he had only seen English period dramas, and those sort of ones that I'd done, and he asked me on the phone, he said, have you done anything that's physically sort of outside of you? And I said, well, I did this little film called Yellow Handkerchief, and that film, which really didn't make much money, didn't have a sort of broad, wasn't broadly released, ended up being the reason that I got cast in The Theory of Everything, because he saw that the mud on the wall element, or like the jumping off a cliff element, he was like, oh, this guy he's happy to jump off a cliff anyway. And so there was a sense that in some ways these things are, maybe I'm not a particularly fatalistic person, but that was there for a reason.
Yeah, no, that actually is brilliantly logical, and what I was looking to hear. And I should really say, I don't at all mean something doesn't work because it doesn't find an audience. Sometimes the greatest work doesn't find an audience. It doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means that it was ahead of its time or whatever. Savage Grace, which for me is my favorite film that you've done so far. I just think a brilliant piece by Tom Kalin. I guess from the outset it was probably a stretch that anybody would go and see it. A lot of people did. Not as many as people will see The Theory of Everything or certainly saw Les Mis, but I'm just wondering any takeaways. I know that that's also a project that's close to your heart. But.
No, that was a project early. This is a true story about the family that inherited the Bakelite fortune, and they lived in New York, and he married this woman from the wrong side of the tracks, and she was a huge sort of extraordinary, Barbara Bakeland, which Julianne Moore plays in the film, huge social climber, and they had a gay son who she ended up sleeping with, and he ended up killing her. And it's an extraordinary kind of Greek story, and it's pretty intense. But that
Going back to the visceral thing I mentioned at the beginning.
Right. But it was a film that when I read the script, it just had such vision. It was its own thing. And that was a film when I was working in London, working in a pub in London. And I remember, Jean, who was here, we fought pretty hard to get in the room because, again, you have no financial currency. No one knows who you are. And I got the part, and then the financing collapsed because, as you can imagine, it's not a massively commercial sell. And then a year later, I'll never forget it, I was working in the same pub in London, and the guy who was my manager was about to go to Lambda, so about to train to be an actor, and he kept talking to me, telling me sort of stuff about his, he was with an agent and what was he doing. He said, "Oh, I've got an audition tomorrow for a film with Julianne Moore. It's called Savage Grace." And I was like, "Whoa!" I literally had to stop myself. I was like, "Really? Really? Oh, that's interesting." Going, "God, wow, I was cast in that." And in my mind, I was like, "No, it's gone." And I remember calling Gene and going, "They're making it." And he's like, "I know, but I think they're maybe looking in a different direction." And that was an amazing moment in which Gene and my agent in Los Angeles, Josh, I remember they were kind of heartbroken because these people invest in you, and we fought our way back into a room. And I'll never forget walking into the room. It was a rainy day in New York. We were downtown, and I walked into a room and absolutely sopping wet, and there was Julianne Moore, and she said, "You even look like my son." And I was like, I've never been so grateful for my freckles in my life. I was like, thank you. But again, on that film, I was then cast again, and then the financing fell through, and it was like you always try not to invest too emotionally in these films. But Tom Kalin, who made that film, who's a mutual friend of ours, is one of these, what I'm realizing now, rare filmmakers, and it was made by Killer Films, who are a New York wonderful producing house, who really give their directors authority and allow them to go and make the film they want to make. And now one of the difficult things with film is that there are so many people with opinions, and what's difficult as an actor is you feel kind of fragile when you're working, and you want to trust one person's voice. You don't want to feel that there's a sort of stream of people behind.
The committee.
Exactly, yeah.
So I'm glad you mentioned your freckles. Brings me to my next topic, which is, look, it's difficult and it's personal, and you can tell me to move on. But I am always concerned with the artists that I value, admire, follow, their ability to keep on, and part of that involves being on all the time. You're at an established point in your career, but you're still early in years. I hope you have a very long career. But did anybody tell you you'd be acting all the time? Like after the theater curtain comes down, after the lights on the cameras are off, you'd be doing things like this. You'd be on the circuit endlessly, and also kind of submitting yourself to what now has become, I find, kind of abominable behavior by certain elements of the industry, the publicity side of the industry. That I, in researching this, came across a clip, some British, I guess it was a late night show or something, where he had all of these famous, important people in a pen, and then he called you out, and he was telling jokes, and then it got to the point where he asked you how far your freckles extended. And I was like, my God, that's the point I would have just walked out. Like, nope, you guys can have all this. I don't want to talk to you anymore. This is horrible. Leave me alone. But you were very dignified, and you made it through somehow. And I have to believe somehow that was continuation of your ability to act through situations.
What Roger's referring to
is I cannot say it. It was so fucking horrible.
For the Brits in here, I did the Jonathan Ross show, and it was my first time doing a British television show, and I'd just got off an airplane from Los Angeles and went straight to the studio, and I was a mixture of jet lagged, but I'd had 3 espressos, so I was sort of half knackered, half wired, and I walked on, and he basically asked me if I had freckles and
He
that
did.
was-
It was horrible.
and it was I was a bit like, well, what planet am I on? Like where? But to the core of your question, back I think it takes.
Why are you here? Why do you keep doing this?
But the core of your question goes back to what you were saying about the Rothko play, which is commerce and art. Now, I think, and I don't mean to be really pretentious about it, but it's the same in the Hawking film of science and art. Jane is an art, studied English. Stephen was a scientist. These ideas of opposites meeting. One of the alchemy that happens in film is through the fact that you have cameramen, you have people who are in charge of lighting, gaffers, the specialists. I mean, even with the I've witnessed promoting the theory of everything. The people from the studios who do specific marketing for specific regions. It's such a big team of people with completely different skills, and the reason there isn't a financial model or an equation for anything is because there will always be that collide. Now, part of the answer to that question is I did films like Savage Grace and The Yellow Handkerchief, and I really try and pour everything into whatever part it is. And so I do feel like when there's an audience, that's a good thing. You're doing this to be a storyteller, and you kind of want the people to see the stories. And so I think this part of it, promoting films, I do understand that it is a business, and but beyond that, not the business, the idea of people actually going and seeing it, and it's easy when it's something you care about. And I think if you really look closely at this, you can always see when those people are talking about their films, or really it's because they're trying to encourage people to see stories they care about.
Well, bravo to you. I really, hats off, because I certainly couldn't deal in the same way. Now just a couple of bullet questions, and then we'll see where that takes us. Is there anything you've decided you won't do?
No.
What are the best pieces of advice you've gotten? And if you care to mention from whom, feel free. But
well, one of them was from a theatre director who directed The Goat, Anthony Page, who said, "Trust your instincts." But it's taken me another 10 years to work out how, because the second you have everyone says that term, like trust your instincts. But how do I know what my instinct is? Because the second you have an instinct, you then start questioning it immediately. And it was interesting, I heard a radio show with Tom Hooper, who directed Les Mis and is a friend, and it was interesting when someone you know really well, but you don't hear them talk about their sort of look on the life. And he said that for him, he likes to make film sets chaotic places because you're being asked 400 and 500 questions a day, and he's learnt to embrace that, because what it does is it makes you just like... I know what that was. It makes you do some weird Thai trick. But it makes you sort of like give your instinct with it before you've got time to question it. And so that's one thing. And the other was, I once read it was an interesting time when I was starting out with, and like a lot of my best pals are actors, and I love actors, and we would all start out in London, but auditioning for the same parts, then in Los Angeles, then in New York, always sort of there's a sense of competition, and it's by the fact that you're all going for the same thing, and yet learning that these people become really, really close friends, some of them, and how to deal with that notion. There was a quote by, this sounds again quite pretentious, by Chekhov to his wife Olga Nipper, which was, "Take life step by step, pace by pace, slowly, slowly, and leave the competition to others." And that's something that for one's own sanity in this industry, which is fiercely competitive, I try and do.
wow, that's brilliant. So keeping one's sanity, how do you keep British? Traveling the world. So I'm wondering, you've worked at home, you've worked abroad. The incentive, I'm sure, at this point will be for you to be away from home more often. But I'm just wondering, do you feel it keeps you grounded to be able to work at home or near home?
So again, wowza, we're on fire this evening. How does one keep British? you wear suits from Savile Row. You fly British Airways. No, I suppose what happens is that, for me, that's home, and everything I was saying about like the nomadic nature of it. I've loved living in North Carolina, living in Louisiana, New Orleans, New York. I've lived here while I was doing the play. But the thing that I've realized with that circus-like existence, and there was a beautiful line in My Week with Marilyn where Kenneth Branagh playing Olivier turns to me and my character and goes, are you happy you joined the circus? And there is that element to it. So, but I've kind of realized that my roots are home, and that's somewhere where you can come home and you're just like, everything's unpacked. And even if you lock it up and go and live somewhere else for a year, having that is very important. And it helps that, a lot of those great theatre directors I've worked with have been British, and those are places that I instinctively kind of keep wanting to go back to.
Well, we're incredibly glad you joined the circus. I think maybe, Luke, do we have time for a few questions? 3 questions. 3 questions for Mr. Redmayne. Yes, Miss, in the corner. What did he think of Emma Watson's UN speech?
I was lucky enough to work with Emma on My Week with Marilyn. It was one of the first things, if not the first thing she'd done after the Harry Potter films, and I just have extraordinary admiration for her. I think putting your head above the parapet to really talk about things you care passionately about is very important, and hence I'm not on Twitter, but the He for She campaign I'm fully behind. I think she's an extraordinary woman and a great actress.
I think I saw one on this side. Or was it about Emma as well? Yes. So the question is about Savage Grace and how his relationship with Julianne Moore kind of flourished and blossomed through that production.
Well, the amazing thing about Savage Grace was it was really early for me, so I was still trying to just sort of sponge up any sort of technique I could. And what I loved was that the way that Julie worked versus the way that Stephen Delane worked, who played her husband, was completely the opposite. I mean, Stephen is a brilliant and quite sort of cerebral actor, wants to rehearse, wants to talk. Julie is someone that just like, she's entirely spontaneous, and it was kind of wonderful for me because I had these 2 very different ways of working, and the sun is kind of caught in between, and I in some ways found that in a sort of stylistic way that I was sort of caught between these 2 different methods. I mean, what I also learnt from Julie was the craft side of the science, as it were, the how cameras work, seeing she knows absolutely where everything is, and she's very strong like that. But for both of us, it was also quite a dream time. We shot the whole thing in Barcelona. It was a beautiful summer and lots of brilliant Spanish actors. I mean, I can hark on about it, but I loved Savage Grace, even though the subject matter was pretty intense.
So I'll reserve the last question for myself then. A, will you promise to come back and visit us on Broadway stages again? And B, will you take care of yourself, please?
For sure. Thank you.
I'm convinced that there's a poster at one point that said, the greatest actresses of our generation, listed all those names you said, and then in there was Hugh Dancy, Patrick Wilson. It's like they're just like, there's not enough to warrant actor, and if anybody ever sees that poster and wants to get me the greatest gift of my life, please just pick it up and